This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Mr. Richard Nephew. I knew Richard when he was in the State Department and I worked counterproliferation issues. He continued to rise throughout his career. He was Deputy Special Envoy for Iran. He was at the National Security Council at the White House, and he was Principal Deputy Coordinator for Sanctions Policy. He's now at Columbia. In addition to being a big-time commentator and expert on all of these issues, ranging from nuclear issues to energy, he also knows sanctions intimately. Stay with us as we speak with Richard Nephew. Richard, thanks so much for joining us today.
No, thanks very much for having me. Always good to talk with you.
Yeah, this will be fun. Lots going on. So let me just state out at the outset, here we are. There are all sorts of indicators that the United States might intervene militarily. What's your gut tell you right now?
My gut says that we're going to go in, that the Israelis at this point don't appear, they might have one, but we haven't seen it yet, to have a plan for how they're going to deal with the Fordo fuel enrichment plant, which basically the U.S. military is uniquely configured to be able to attack and destroy, as well as some of these other parts of the nuclear program that really only the U.S. Air Force is equipped to deal with. And I think that argument that if you want to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, you have to act is going to prove pretty persuasive to the president.
So I guess I was a little surprised that Israel didn't have an apparent plan to blow up Fordo before they started, which led me to wonder whether President Trump had said, well, go ahead. Maybe I'll get in later if you're having some success, or if Netanyahu just went in anyway and hoped political pressure and or Trump's willingness, longtime statements to say that they cannot get a bomb would overtake his reluctance and he would do it anyway. What's your analysis of that? Do you think they started on this without any plan whatsoever and just gambled that the U.S. would get in?
So I have to believe that they have a plan. It might just be that they don't like their plan, right? That the choices that they had to deal with Fordo just simply are not as good and not as simple, not as clean, and entail a lot more risk than having a B-2 bomber fly over and use the massive ordnance penetrator. And so I find it absolutely impossible that they didn't enter in with some kind of plan. But my kind of assumption at the moment is that they've all along hoped, thought, encouraged, urged the U.S. to get involved with the expectation that we would do so if they were demonstrating results.
I know you know a lot, may not be a complete weapons, explosives type expert here, but for some period of time, the thought has been, as you say, that the United States 30,000-pound bomb, known as the massive ordnance penetrator, could do the job here. And well, one, do you just agree with that? And two, do you believe, and if you know from your classified background, obviously don't say it, do you believe that there's any scenario under which, one, they transferred the bomb somehow over to the Israelis, or two, because you could only use the bomb out the back of a B-2, that some Israelis possibly have been training on the B-2, or are those just too cute by half?
So my gut is that those would be too cute by half. And, there's other issues in there too. I mean, so my understanding is the MOP can only be deployed out of the B-2. That's how it was configured. And the B-2, since it's also the U.S. strategic bomber, and there aren't hundreds of them, that we'd be pretty reluctant to land one of our B-2s to the Israelis, for this sort of purpose. Frankly, I also think if that was part of the mix, we probably have already seen it used already. We're now 5 days in. I would imagine it would have been used at this point. So my expectation is that, both we kept control of our B-2s, we kept control of the MOP, and that we haven't, looked into realistic scenarios for making it available to the Israelis. I do think, again, I defer to my colleagues and former colleagues in the Air Force. I do think that the MOP can do the job. I don't think that the MOP is a perfect device either, though, right? There is risk, and there is the possibility of missing. There's the possibility for not being able to have the kinds of efficacy that we think, which is part of the reason why, military option has always been seen as something that you only do when you're out of other choices. And I think those are the same kind of concerns that are probably being presented to the president, right now.
So one more on the courses of action here. I've heard for years that the Israelis at one point were seriously considering a commando raid that might have turned into a suicide raid. But I was really upset, and I understand the Israelis were too, that the New York Times reported that buried in one of their newspaper articles. Remember about 5 weeks ago when there was sort of a readout of what had happened on Netanyahu's visit? Is there anything you can say about that? I assume that's totally off the table now because there are thousands of troops probably in the vicinity, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so this has been kicking around for a little while as a possibility. Again, with I think a high amount of risk that's attached to it. For all I know, that's one of the Plan Bs that is in Bibi's pocket if he were to decide that they were lacking other options, and this is the only way to try and access Fordo. But I think on the one hand, I think it remains pretty high risk. I mean, you have to imagine that the Iranians have flooded that space with a lot of security, and right now it'd be a real problematic time to try and engage there. On the other hand, I mean, I think that the technical reality is that the Israelis have air superiority over the entire country, and so they could potentially use that position to support such a force. But again, I keep coming back to I'm a simple enough guy. I think if the Israelis thought that was going to be the best option, they probably would have done it already. They know as well as we do that Fordo's a high risk place if you're trying to prevent nuclear weapons. So you got to believe that the reason why they haven't is because they just don't love their Plan Bs. They'd much prefer their Plan A.
And maybe they've calculated correctly that Trump will get involved. And there's a lot of articles in history that will reveal what kind of conversations have been going on the last few months. Okay, so Fordow, I mean, we'll talk to some Air Force people as well, but as far as everyone knows, we believe one or two of the MOPS would be successful. So that's Fordow. I'll come back to you in a second and ask you a sort of a catch-all question about any other issues that I'm missing. But let's now go to Natanz. Natanz was their first centrifuge facility. It is largely above ground, as I understand it, although there are rumors, and maybe I'll get you to address this third site rumor that I've heard so much about. And I've also heard that portions of Natanz are now underground. But in any event, open source seems to indicate two things. One, that at first there was a power outage at Natanz and that some of the centrifuges might have spun out of control, thereby breaking. And then two, 48 hours later, we hear, well, there's been a, quote, implosion of the building, the underground facility part of Natanz. Can you take us through this Natanz issue? When and including when did they build what?
Yeah. So, Natanz really is what set this all off. If you go way back in your history to 2002, when Iran's nuclear program was first kind of exposed by the NCRI, which is a dissident and terrorist affiliated group at the time, they came out and said that the Iranians were building two sites. They were building a reactor at a place called Arak, so it's ARAK, not IRAQ. But they were building a reactor there, and that they were building a uranium enrichment plant at Natanz. And we started, seeing it on the imagery, that including in public, of them digging two enormous multi-football field sort of facilities, that were basically in the cutout of an L. It's kind of the way I always like to think about it. Those two massive centrifuge halls are buried. They're under cement. They're under dirt. They're essentially centrifuge bunkers, and that's the place where the Iranians have had, tens of thousands of centrifuges for a while. The plan was basically to have 54,000 centrifuges located underneath there. Above ground, they have a whole range of other facilities. So they have the above ground pilot fuel enrichment plant. So that's where they've first been playing with centrifuges going back many, many years, as well as a whole bunch of other support equipment, including, the power stations that you were talking about. And so what we understand is that the Israelis in their first attacked the pilot fuel enrichment plant, basically destroyed it. Makes sense. It was above ground, relatively easy to destroy with from an aircraft. And they also destroyed some of the power stations that were actually, fueling and powering the centrifuges that were down below. Doing that, interrupting the power, absolutely could have had a destructive impact on the centrifuges. You have to think about these things as spinning, thousands of revolutions, per minute. And so if you cut the power kind of unexpectedly, and you lose control as a result, these centrifuges can rapidly become unstable and crash on the sidewalls and then die. They explode. And so this could absolutely happen just as a result of a power cutoff. You might remember, some of these press reports that have gone back years about Stuxnet and cyber attacks, and all these were intended to essentially turn the centrifuge into their own bombs by messing with the power. And so that is part of what probably shut down a bunch of centrifuges early on in the campaign in the underground. We also have recently, as you said, heard about some attacks on the hulls themselves. And if you look at some of the satellite imagery that's commercially available, you can see craters on some of these pieces. What's unclear, or at least was unclear until the Director General of the IEA came out today and said so, was whether or not there had actually been penetration through the concrete and the dirt down in the centrifuge halls. And what he was saying is that there has been some amount of penetration into the hulls. It's unclear whether or not a bunch of the centrifuges have been destroyed that way too. We just don't know, or whether or not any of the enriched uranium underneath there has been compromised too. That's an open question at this point. And frankly, you're not really going to get a real clear, independent sense of what went on there because the IEA is not wandering around a war zone.
So if I'm President Trump and I'm getting involved anyway because of Fordell, I mean, you need to just, it seems like that because we have big questions about a bomb damage assessment, you might as well go ahead and finish off Natanz. Am I right?
That's what makes sense to me. Look, I think if we had chosen to do this, there is a wide list of nuclear sites that would have been on the Air Force's target list, and it would have included Natanz, Fordo, the Iraq reactor that I mentioned earlier, the Esfahan uranium conversion plant, which we might talk about too.
Yeah, that's next.
Whole range of nuclear sites, in the country, in part because we still have got a lot of questions about the extent of the Iranian nuclear program, where they've hidden, a lot of their equipment, but the stuff we know about absolutely could fuel a nuclear weapons effort. And so at a minimum, if you're going to do this and you're not attacking those facilities, frankly, you're not approaching this with belt and suspenders, which I think is probably what you want to do.
So let's go to Esfahan. It's definitely the uranium conversion facility, and I'm sure that part has been blown up. But let me ask you also, because I'm reading reports, and this seems to make sense, that the, whatever it is, 250 kilograms of HEU enriched to 60% is there and has not been blown up. All kinds of people are saying all kinds of things on X about it would cause radioactivity or whatever. To walk us through that, do I have the basic facts right? If we blew it up, would it spread radioactivity everywhere? Would this be I'm sure not, but would it be a Chernobyl situation? And or if we, the United States, decided to drop a big bomb on this to blow up the existing store, is there any, I mean, I'm just totally making this up here. Would it incinerate, or would you have some radioactivity in the air? Would it be like a dirty bomb?
Yeah. Look, I mean, so a couple of things. I mean, one, there definitely is enriched uranium at Esfahan. There's also enriched uranium at Natanz. There's also enriched uranium at Fordo, right? The centrifuges run on enriched uranium. They have cylinders of enriched uranium in all these places. And so, at a minimum, we've got this problem already in these various different places. Some of that enriched uranium is probably accessible. Some of it's probably not. You were mentioning earlier, some of these questions about tunnels around Natanz. This is one of the questions that we have is, where is all that uranium now? The Iranians had, not a lot of warning. They had some warning that these facilities are going to be under attack. At Fordo, they had lots of warning. And there's press reports indicating the Iranians have started moving stuff. So we do have a fundamental baseline question of where the enriched uranium is. And I think we should keep a pin in that one, because as I'm worried about the long-term arc of this, even if you destroy the existing facilities, you still have that as a problem of where that material could go. Could it go off to some undisclosed, secret location? The Iranians were just about to announce a new enrichment site. This is one of their retaliations to the International Atomic Energy Agency's resolution censuring Iran for not complying with its obligations, last week. So anyway, the bottom line is that we have an enriched uranium problem. If the U.S. were to attack directly the enriched uranium stockpile, I mean, first of all, that would be a little difficult depending on where it is. If it's in these tunnels, you may not have the ability to try and land something on it directly. Obviously, the Iranians are aware of the risk, and so they've been trying to put it into protected sorts of spaces. I don't think we're in a situation in which you're incinerating the uranium or so forth. I think there is an issue of spreading it, and this is a real question, frankly, for a munitions expert of whether or not there are ways in which you can use munitions that would try and contain it to some extent. But I think there is a fundamental problem of if you miss it, then they have intact uranium they could take elsewhere. If you hit it, then you are going to have spillage, and you're going to have uranium going all which way, depending on what kinds of munitions you use and those sorts of things. In terms of radioactivity, Chernobyl, those sorts of things, basically, I think we're okay here from that standpoint. What you're really worried about for a Chernobyl-like scenario is if Israel were to hit, or the U.S. were to hit, the Bushehr nuclear power plant. So hitting an active reactor, which is running through uranium and producing plutonium, that's bad, right? Yeah. That's where you have radioactive plumes. That's where you've got a real danger to the community and surrounding environment. And Bushehr is right on the water, so potentially you have material heading west as well into the Persian Gulf, into neighbors. I think if the uranium were to be hit, you have a spillage issue. You definitely have a radiation contamination issue. But here you're basically talking about a risk of ingestion, respiration. Those are the kinds of problems you're talking about. And that can be dealt with respirators and that kind of protective gear, as the Director General was in fact talking about a couple of days ago.
Okay, so it's not the end of the world. It's probably not terrific, but it feels like a manageable situation. Okay, tell us about the so-called third enrichment site that we've been reading about. You alluded to it. Take us through it.
So, we don't know a whole lot about what the Iranians were intending to announce. And again, we had the actions, take place to kind of preempt some of those steps. It very well could have been that the Iranians intended to announce some of the facilities that they're building in tunnels that are located in and around the existing nuclear sites. It could have been they had some other plan. I think that the bigger problem, and what I would put my finger on, is what happened to all the centrifuge components the Iranians have been making over the course of the last 4 years. So back in 2021, a centrifuge component workshop was attacked, and there were additional attacks. And the Iranians decided they weren't going to cooperate as they were required to under the JCPOA by providing information about where those components were going. And so essentially for 4 years, the Iranians had been moving centrifuge components elsewhere in the country. We don't know where. We don't know how many. We don't know whether or not they're setting up a new centrifuge plant someplace. We don't know if they're in crates. We don't know a lot about what's been going on with those centrifuges. We don't know whether or not they could take the enriched uranium that they're pulling out of Fordo, Esfahan, Natanz, run it right through and make weapons. We don't know if it would take them a lot of time to set up the centrifuges. A lot of unknowns that surround us with regard to an additional site, either the one they were pointing to or one that they weren't even intending to point to last week.
Fascinating. Okay, so we're going to get to the verification aspects in the future later. Before we get to weaponization, are there any other, and everyone knows there's 3 steps to a nuclear bomb. There's fissile material. We're talking plutonium or uranium in this case. There's the delivery system. Weaponization is next. But in terms of targets, and I agree with you that I bet there's been Iranian diversion, are there any other quote-unquote fissile material targets that either the Israelis haven't hit, can't hit, and or would be on the U.S. target list?
So, I mean, again, if you were choosing this belt and suspenders, there are some uranium mines that you could potentially target as a way of just, ending the ability to import, material into the fuel cycle. But basically what you're talking about is the Natanz site, Esfahan site, Iraq site, Fordo site. There's been some talk about the Tehran research reactor. I think that'd be pretty dangerous to hit, not least because you have the same problem as Bushehr about having a potential radioactive incident. And it's not clear to me at all that the Tehran research reactor would be useful as part of a breakout sort of scenario. So thus far, at least according to what the IEA has said, it's not been targeted. My guess is it won't be targeted, which makes a ton of sense. But then you've got obviously a whole range of workshops, and this gets to your weaponization point, and facilities that are owned by the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, where they were doing additional work. Those may or may not have fissile material in them. They may or may not have been weaponization related, but those have also been targeted by the Israelis, and probably more of them will be targeted as well.
All right, so let's talk about weaponization. So we the Iranians build the fissile material. Is the easiest way to explain weaponization the process by which you make that fissile material go boom?
Sort of. I mean, so the way I would describe it is, when you have the material come out of the centrifuges, you've got a bunch of other stuff mixed with it, including a fluorine gas. You got to remove that, and you got to turn it into metal, and you got to turn it into metal so that way you can shape it into weapons components. So basically, you take it out of the centrifuges, you put it through a process to strip it down into metal, and then the metal is what you shape and then can put into either a warhead for a missile or a device that you would just detonate on site, or a bomb, or any of the other kind of variants that you're talking about.
So there are a variety of different, as you said, workshops, laboratories, other sites that we've read about. Obviously, the Israelis are hitting all sorts of different types of things. Going back to at least 2007, the view of the U.S. intelligence community has been that that Iran is not working on weaponization per se. They confusingly called it building a nuclear weapon way back when, which led everybody to believe, well, wow, how does HEU play into this, et cetera. But we're strictly talking about the weaponization process. And Tulsi Gabbard repeated that longstanding conclusion at the worldwide threats hearings at the HIPSI and the SISI within 6 weeks. By the way, Trump said last night, I don't care what she said, when asked about that during the gaggle on the way back from Canada. But the Israelis seem to be saying that, you know what, we uncovered, and maybe they're putting a different gloss on things, but they're essentially saying, you know what, we've uncovered new things. Their quote unquote weaponization group, their weapons group, started meeting again in earnest after the October Israeli bombing of Iran. And now we're convinced more than ever that Iran is going nuclear. And that's why we had to do what we had to do. That was the truly last step, that we just can't stomach anything. And we'll get into all this threshold nuclear power, et cetera. But first of all, what do you have to say about that? Does it sound like spin? I know you've been in dozens of meetings with the U.S. and Israel on Iranian nuclear intelligence. Give me your view here.
So look, I think a couple of things can be true at once. It's absolutely true that the Iranians have been working on the long pole in the tent, which is production of weapons usable materials. It's long been the thing that they really needed to do. Weaponization is a problem. It's something you have to work through to get to nuclear weapons, obviously. But, the thing that takes a lot of time, resource, facilities, and that sort of thing is on the material side. By producing as much 60% enriched uranium as the Iranians have, they have effectively solved that problem. Now, it's not quite the same thing as having 90% enriched uranium, which is what you actually put into a bomb. But, effectively, I think we can say they're capable of doing that. That is not anymore a potential vulnerability. So the real problem from their perspective, from Iran's perspective, is, what do we do once we get 90%? Can we actually put it into metal and then put it into a device? The Iranians have been playing around with those associated technologies both prior to the halt order that was issued in 2003, 2004, and subsequently. I think the consensus intelligence view, both in the United States and Israel, is that it was always playing with, working on, thinking about, but never actually a dedicated program to try and move down that path. And that's what Tulsi Gabbard was referring to back in March, which is, so far as I understand it, remains the U.S. position that we've seen some things, but we haven't seen a dedicated program in which the boss has said go and they are moving to go. So I think two things could be true here. Thing one is that the Israelis have picked up intel that is not available to the United States or wasn't available to the United States back in March. And it's new, it's recent, and that indicates that they've made a move. I don't think anybody can say that's impossible. That certainly could be true, and it's consistent with what the Iranian strategic risk is right now, since they lost their proxy forces over the course of the last, year and a half, and have a lot more vulnerability to the Israelis. The other thing that could be true is that all this stuff's been going on. The Iranians hadn't actually made a decision, but that the Israelis saw both a political moment of opportunity and risk that they decided to address by going now. Risk being that Donald Trump would do a bad deal with the Iranians, an opportunity that the Iranians were uniquely vulnerable at this moment of time, and it was an opportunity they couldn't let go to waste.
Yeah. Give us a couple of other examples of what weaponization looks like neutron initiators, high explosives, etc. Give us some sense of how you're in a workshop working on that, but it's not necessarily with the explicit intent of the orders from the supreme leader to build a bomb. Talk about that for a second.
So you just mentioned a couple that are good examples of this. So the high explosives piece, right? Doing work with very carefully, fabricated high explosives, because to make a nuclear explosion work properly, you need the explosives to go off simultaneously if you're doing an implosion type device, or at least on time, regardless of how you're doing it. And so getting that high explosive precision down right is vital if you're going to make this work, as opposed to having it be a fizzle or have your explosion not go exactly as you wish. And this is the kind of thing that both requires science, but as I understand from people who have done it, art, right? They have to kind of think a little bit about how they work. They have to kind of understand how the materials work and how they interact, those sorts of things. Neutron generation, same kind of thing. It requires working with materials that potentially can trigger the neutrons required to actually trigger a nuclear explosion, especially if you are trying to do this in a much more sophisticated way, as opposed to the crude devices that we used in 1945, where you actually have to initiate something that you won't be doing with some of the other kind of older type devices. And so what I would say is the Iranians have been working on the various subsystems for a number of years, whether it's high explosives or it's the triggers and making sure all the explosions happen at once, or then it's neutron generation, even things like, trying to actually physically fabricate the warhead itself for a missile, right? What does it look like? What's its shape? How does a package go into it? All that requires some work, some people, working on the technologies, working on the machinery required to do this sort of stuff. Some of that you can say is legitimately dual use, right? So, high explosives work, as the Iranians said, they've been doing high explosive work for mining operations. You want your mining explosives to go off on sequence, otherwise you hurt your miners. Do I believe that? No. But do I think it is a plausible civilian explanation the Iranians struck upon? Sure. And that's what they've been saying for years. And again, you can say this all down the line, either dual use military, like conventional, missile parts, or, things that have civil applications that they've said that they've been playing on that clearly have an application to the nuclear side of things.
Okay. One more question on the nuclear side of things, and then we're going to get into regime change and economic targets, which I sort of see in the same boat. So many people have said, and again, we'll get into verification later, but so many people have said, well, you know what? This is all well and good, but you can't unlearn how to enrich uranium. The hard part is going from 0 to 60, not 60 to 90. You sure kill 11 scientists, but this is something that is entirely achievable again. What do you have is that enough not to should it have convinced the Israelis not to go forward with this, or what's your view?
So look, I think all those things are true. Unlearning is hard. Unlearning as a system is harder, right? Again, the Israelis can kill scientists, but if they have structured, academic exercise in which they're teaching this sort of stuff, and they've got students who know it, and they've got hundreds of technicians across dozens of sites, that's really hard to undo. And look, we have a real life example of this in the post-Soviet Union when we were working to try and redirect some of their scientists to avoid them going in and working for the North Koreans or the Iranians or the Libyans or some of these other people. We spent a lot of time, money, and effort trying to train these folks and work with them on alternative projects, because there's a risk that these guys, can go over the fence and use this kind of knowledge in other sorts of places. So, look, it's a real risk. I think ultimately the most effective way to deal with this challenge is threefold. One, to remove the security and economic incentives associated with proliferation. That's hard to do. We tried to do it with the JCPOA. I know a lot of people had differing views about that, but it was at least a construct to give the Iranians an economic incentive to not engage in this sort of work and to take some of the security benefits that they would get away from it by reducing their program. Second big way you can do it is, frankly, total destruction of all the facilities associated with it, and essentially trying to deal with the people the same sorts of ways. That's really hard, right? A complete dismantlement operation is something that would be really difficult to prove. It'd be really difficult to verify. We've seen this with Iraq in the 1990s, where we didn't have confidence in something that we actually thought, in retrospect, it actually did work, but we didn't have that confidence because of how tough this really is. And the third big, opportunity or chance you have is if the Iranians themselves decide they want to give up the ghost, that they see the downsides of having this program as too significant. I think the path that is trying to be shown by the Israelis right now and that the president might engage in is you basically make the security concerns so great about having these sorts of programs, the Iranians give it up. You don't have too many examples of that in history, at least those who are not allies of the United States who had some sort of more compelling security benefit. But there are some. There are the South Africans, there are the Libyans. So, there may be some space there, but that's a hard path to suggest, especially considering the ongoing conflict.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Richard Nephew.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Let me just ask you, Israel, this is a bit of a surprise to me, seems to be leaning into regime change a little bit more than I thought. Netanyahu said to Bret Baier, you know what, it's a logical outcome basically of how things are going. There's obviously something to these newspaper articles that Israel wanted to assassinate the supreme leader. I think there have been at least three, maybe several oil and gas type refineries that have been hit. Now, they have not gone towards what I understand would be the great enchilada of Karg Island, and I want to get to that in a minute. But maybe comment a little bit on the Israelis' rationale. It's not just military and nuclear sites, is it?
No, I actually think we need to take the Israelis a little bit more at face value here. I think that they are showing that they have no confidence that a post-conflict scenario in which the Islamic Republic is still the Islamic Republic is one that they can trust. And I think they don't believe that the United States is going to be prepared to be an occupying force the way that we were in Iraq. They know they're not in a position to be an occupying force. And, that means at some point the military campaign will end. The soldiers and airmen are not going to be there. And they have to be confident of what's left and it not being a threat. And I think, from an Israeli perspective, the math that they eventually come down to is, well, that means that it can't be the same regime. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to insist that regime change is the essential outcome. But I think they absolutely prefer it, and they prefer it as an outcome, especially because then that has the benefits, presumably, on the regional side and so forth. At a minimum, it's chaos inside of Iran, and so they can't rearm Hezbollah and other such groups. So I think if we look at what they are doing, they are attempting to destabilize the regime enough that they believe the Iranian population would be more incentivized to rise up and to push down a government that is deeply unpopular and for a really good reason. I think the problem with the Israeli logic is, though, that they're trying to achieve a lot of things at once. They're trying to decapitate the IRGC for regional reasons. They're trying to destroy the nuclear program. They're trying to destabilize the country. It's not apparent to me that the Iranian population was ready to revolt. And if they're not ready to revolt, then it's not really clear to me how you get from where we are today to better Iran. It's just as likely that you have regime change into a much more hardline scenario. And I know some people listening are saying more hardline scenario, you're crazy. I actually think there are scenarios where people in the Revolutionary Guards and others, take over, and they're far less willing to consider compromise, far more militaristic, far more nationalistic, and that's not necessarily a better outcome, here either. But I think the Israeli logic is we can't trust this government, so if we can knock it over, then more the better.
Now, I haven't seen anybody rising up. I mean, now on the other hand, I thought I would see more rally to the flag than I have, and I have not seen a lot of it. It's hard to say. Who knows what's going on? But
it's hard to say. It's early days too. I mean, I would actually counsel that as a general sort of comment for everybody. I've been not sleeping a whole lot. I'm sure you haven't been sleeping a whole lot. It is only day 5, and it's worth noting that day 5 is a hard time to predict where we think people are going, especially when people are pretty scared. They're still trying to figure things out, and they're faced with the circumstance that they didn't actually expect.
Thinking strictly politically, it doesn't seem like a good strategy to get Donald Trump involved if you're hyping a regime change rhetorically or in the target sets that you're going after, because that would just inflame the idea that, oh, well, my God, this is a neocon regime change exercise, not something rooted in international security policy.
Yeah, I have to say, I think we're seeing this in the pushback that's, again, kind of bipartisan or unpartisan, whatever the right way of looking at it, from a kind of across the spectrum, where I think a lot of people are kind of harkening back to past examples and they've got some nervousness here. I actually think if we look at some of the initial rhetoric coming out of Israel and look at it today, they've softened some of the regime change language. They've kind of come back to the core nuclear issues. If Fordo is still sitting out there, that allows the argument to be made there too. But I think ultimately it's going to be a question of, do we think this could be successful? And, if it's going to be successful, then the president might be more inclined to get involved. My big concern, and I really think we should have this all in the back of our heads, is the commitment problem. Are we going to be committed to keeping U.S. forces there to, police, what happens in the nuclear program and other spaces? Are we going to be responding when we see, IRGC guys taking a rump state of Iran over and what they might do with it? Those are all the ramifications that happen out of this. And that commitment problem, if you were to have regime collapse or at least regime reshaping, is pretty significant. And without having a pretty clear sense of what we're trying to do and a clear and agreed sense, it's a pretty tricky thing to get involved in.
So you rightly said it's early days on destabilization of the population, but I've been getting this question a lot. I mean, I haven't seen the besieged force, for example, blown up. I mean, I don't see any evidence that the repressive tools of the authoritarian government have gone anywhere. They may be busy right now, but they, I think, would get back on their motorcycles if something were going down in the streets.
I totally agree. And I think, the internal repression capabilities of this regime shouldn't be underestimated. And unless you're going to have, some sort of arming of groups inside of Iran, which, as far as I'm aware, no one's doing, it's pretty hard to imagine the Iranian population, pushing back in that space or doing so for a persistent amount of time. I think the reality is the Iranian security people have demonstrated they're prepared to kill in order to maintain power. The Iranian population has not been prepared at this point to risk that. And I think it's hard to see those examples. I think it's also worth noting the Iranian people have looked at regional scenarios and they're not liked what they've seen. They've looked at scenarios like Syria, and I don't think they're excited about entering a 10-year conflict in which, cities are being destroyed like Aleppo and similar. When people make the Syria illusion now, today, in 2025, we're thinking about December when Assad was forced to go, and that's all well and good. Think about the preceding 12 years. Those were pretty ugly years if you're a Syrian. And I think if you're an Iranian, you're still kind of trying to evaluate what's going to come next before you take those sorts of jumps.
Okay, back to energy targets. Let's just lay aside for a second the destabilization and whether it's about regime change or whatever it's about. Let's assume that the Israelis, for whatever reason, decide that they are going to escalate on the energy critical infrastructure side of things. And there have been a few targets, refineries or whatever. Outline for us how you believe the escalation ladder might go.
So the Iranians have been pretty clear for years now that if they can't export oil and gas, no one will. And that was part of their logic with the maximum pressure campaign response they had in the first Trump administration. And part of the reason why they attacked places like Opcake in Saudi Arabia and ships that were transiting the Straits of Hormuz. Now, the Arab states are playing this one differently. They backed away from some of the cut the head off snake rhetoric that was, their previous position. They were much more willing to entertain diplomacy with the Iranians this go around, much more encouraging of a deal. They themselves have been trying to work something out with the Iranians and some of their security concerns. So all that adds up to me to a marked reluctance by those states that would probably be the Iranians' targets to get involved. But look, if you're the Iranians and you do hold to that position that if no one else can export oil, neither will we. And if you combine to that we have to escalate to de-escalate, and that they think Donald Trump is motivated by financial terms, that he won't like to see high oil prices, those sorts of things, that the Chinese might get involved if oil starts to get interfered with, I think you can very easily see the Iranians decide to start ratcheting up things. And that probably looks first with harassment operations in the Straits of Hormuz, going after ships that are transiting the Straits. Probably not trying to close it in the first instance, but maybe they hint, we do have all these mines and we're capable of putting them in the water. Maybe they land a drone very close to a ship or to an onshore, oil or gas facility and have a big sign on it that says the next one can hit it. Things like that to try and encourage people to intercede with the United States to get us to back off. I think ultimately, if the United States gets in, the Iranians are going to attack back, and they're going to attack at bases that are involved with the operations and countries that are housing those people. And those are distributed throughout the region. Those facilities are in Qatar, they're in Bahrain, they're in UAE. I mean, you've got U.S. forces in a lot of different places. Yeah, and ultimately, it's going to involve going after oil and gas too. So, to me, I think it is very plausible in the next week or so that you could see attacks being made on oil and gas facilities, both onshore or on the water. Maybe even attempts to close the straits. The real problem from the Iranian perspective is they know if they do that, that's going to absolutely ensure U.S. involvement. So exactly. There's a bit of a first mover question that's involved here.
So just on the Straits of Hormuz, I mean, it's not like the U.S. Navy has been thinking about this for decades and decades. I mean,
right.
By the way, last night when I saw those, I don't even know if it was fake, but when I saw on X the ship that was on fire, I wondered if this was some elaborate Iranian scheme to shut down the straits. Apparently it wasn't. But how do you think it would go down? And wouldn't the U.S. Navy steam in there? So is that a real threat?
Well, I mean, again, I don't think it's a threat if they want to keep the U.S. out. But if the U.S. is in, then it might be the thing that they think can compel the United States to try and stop. I mean, I think, this goes to this big question of a use it or lose it scenario for the Iranians. They've been practicing closing the straits and harassing ships in the straits for a number of years, too. If they truly think the objective of the U.S. and of Israel is regime change, frankly, why wouldn't you tell the IRGC Navy to then do those sorts of things? Or why wouldn't commanders of the IRGC Navy decide to do those sorts of things, too? They might risk, being defeated. I mean, I have utmost confidence in the U.S. Navy to defeat the Iranian Navy. I have utmost confidence in our ability to clear mines and to relieve shipping and so forth. But there would be a disruption. I think most scenarios expect there to be at least some amount of disruption, associated both with military activity as well as with any mining and similar. So it's not, I don't think the first choice that the Iranians will have. But again, if they're faced with it's this or nothing, I don't know. I mean, that really gets down to a psychological question in Tehran of whether or not they're prepared to burn down something very important to the other side in order to maximize those costs and try and get to a better deal or to a ceasefire or similar sorts of steps. It's an uncertainty that I think we have to accept is real, and that the Iranians be much more prepared to do it than if we're staying out of the fight.
Okay. I want to come back to what cards Iran has in a second, but finish taking us up the escalation ladder in terms of energy infrastructure. Explain what Karg Island is, and is this basically the most important, the linchpin of the entire Iranian economy?
I think it's fair to say that. I mean, basically think of it as the distribution center, right? And so if you take that
of oil
offline,
and gas, of everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's their primary export terminal, right? And so they don't actually export gas because they don't have LNG, right? And it's a technology they don't have. So their exports of gas are going through pipeline and primarily going to Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Iraq, folks that are nearby. But in terms of their primary oil export terminal, it's a place where they've got a lot of ships tying up. It's a lot of materials that are coming through there. Is it the linchpin of their economy? It's definitely the linchpin of their export economy. I guess that'd be a way of saying it. It's vital to their oil and gas sector. It is a place through which the country's economy has thrived when it has thrived. It's crucially important to the Iranian economy. At the same time, it is in the current crisis, probably a long-term requirement for the Iranians to have KARG as opposed to the near-term one, right? So, will the Iranian economy stop if KARG no longer exists? I mean, no. I mean, people are still going to be, driving cars so they can get gasoline. They're still going to be, using the phone, the banking system. I mean, those sorts of things are there too. So I think, where I've kind of looked at this is if you're attempting to undermine Iran's ability to export oil, if you're attempting to undermine their ability to play, internationally, KARG is absolutely essential. But even if you were to destroy it tomorrow, does that mean there is no Iranian economy? No. I mean, there's still economic operators who are going to be doing stuff in the country. There are other ports that they could potentially use. So vital, important, but not necessarily this is the kill switch for Iran.
So I've asked these questions as if Israel wants to escalate all the way. I mean, but let's assume that the Iranians, who obviously have some ballistic missile shortages issues, decide to target more Israeli energy infrastructure and maybe even their, development that they've got going on out at the Mediterranean, et cetera, et cetera. Is that, do you think the Iranians would even bother? They seem more interested in hitting civilian targets, payback. How do you describe a scenario in which Iran says, you know what, we're ready to hit some Israeli energy targets?
Yeah, and they have. I mean, so they've launched on
the refinery, in Haifa.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think the way I'm looking at Iranian targeting right now, and I'm happy to have someone else disagree with me, but I've been trying to look at the patterns, try and see. I think that they are trying for a mix of targets. They have definitely attacked what I think you could reasonably describe as military targets, like attacking the IDF. They've attacked intelligence headquarters and at least attempted to do so. And they've attacked energy targets. And certainly they've also attacked civilian targets and residences and those sorts of things. And so I think their targeting profile has been fairly wide. And it's because their objectives are both to scare the Iranian population or Israeli population, and to try and convince the Israeli population to tell Bibi to stop, right? They're trying to interfere with war activities, so going after the IDF and similar. And absolutely, they're trying to send a signal that they're prepared to mess with global energy, I would think, and also directly affect Israel's ability to provide energy to its planes and so on and so forth. Now, I think that the problem, of course, has been that all this is a little bit having to run to the fact that the Israelis have been remarkably effective in shooting down these missiles. So, we don't have a full picture of what the Iranian attack plan is, in fact, because the Israelis have been pretty successful. If they weren't, we might have a better sense of what the priority was for the Iranians and whether or not they're just, taking advantage of opportunities, right? If it's an opportunistic approach or if they're just getting lucky with strikes getting through, as opposed to they are intending with this campaign to do this and this campaign to do that.
All right, great answer. You've prompted me to ask you more about the Iranian ballistic missiles. So I'm basically hearing that, they were ramping up production. They had about 2,000. The Israelis knocked out about 20%. Then they sent several hundred over. They have about 1,000 left. I mean, you can correct these numbers. But basically, they have a dilemma. The Iranians have a dilemma, which is essentially, if I actually want to get through the missile defense shield, not just the United States, but Arrow and et cetera, I got to shoot, I don't know, I've heard 40, some people even say 100. Mm-hmm. And then that really, you can get pretty fast to a scenario where they're running out of ballistic missiles. Right. Versus if we just do 4 to 5 or 10, which I'm sure they would like to do, then the missile systems can take those out easily. So is that accurate? And two, What does that augur for the future of the war? Does that mean really Iran is out of? We'll talk about Iran's other card soon, but does that mean they're out of ballistic missiles and that's their primary way to get at Israel?
It might be. I mean, so I think, there's also the launcher issue, right? It might be that they've got a bunch of missiles, but they don't have enough launchers anymore because the Israelis apparently have been, targeting them. There's, again, press reports, and we're all seeing the pictures on Twitter and all that where, you can see tells, having been targeted by the Israelis, so these are the ballistic missile launchers. So it very well could be that the Iranians have missiles but can't fire them, or have had losses in their missile force because of Israeli attack or failure or any number of different things. But I think there's two. That's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is what the interception rate is and how many interceptors are still available to the Israelis. And on that, for obvious reasons, I don't know that we've got a public number of how many interceptors the Israelis still have. It's not something they would want anybody to know about. But there's speculation out there that they're starting to run through some of their more advanced interception, missiles, and that they're starting to have to use older ones that are kind of stockpiled, which may not be as good. And so I think there's a point at which the Iranians are trying to test Israeli defenses. The Israelis are trying to prevent Iranian attacks. I don't know that we can automatically assume that the Iranians are losing their cards. They may also just be at this point testing to see, okay, are the Israelis about out of defense mechanisms, and then they could launch a mass onslaught. I think one thing we do know is that the Israeli operations on Moment One were to try and prevent the exact kind of barrage that you're talking about. And so I think what we were all expecting was that the Iranians would massively attack in Moment One, try and overwhelm the Israeli defenses. They weren't able to do that. Now they've lost some of the capacity to do that. So I think we still have to see a little bit whether or not the Iranians can recover, or whether or not the Israelis have dumped them enough of a bad hand that now they're out of options there. That also might then include, by the way, that they start firing missiles at things that are less protected. Israel is very well protected with its overlapping missile defense system. The U.S. has been supporting that too. A lot of places in the Middle East that don't have that same sort of capacity.
What cards does Iran have left to play? We've got Straits of Hormuz. They get out of the NPT. They accept a diplomatic something or other. But as I understand it, still have a lot of short-range ballistic missiles. People used to say, well, you know what the Israelis are going to do? I mean, the Iranians are going to do? They're going to hit UAE, and then they're going to do another ab-cake situation in Saudi Arabia where they take aim at Saudi Arabia's oil export facilities. What's your sense? Would they do that at this point? Hit the UAE and Saudi? That seemed like something that was plausible before, but now it's almost as if, wow, you're so embarrassed by the Israelis. It seems like you should train your fire there.
Maybe, but I mean, again, this is where it goes, I think, into your evaluation of what the Iranian sense of vulnerability is. If they believe that they are truly about to be toppled and the regime is about to collapse, that's when they're going to be very vulnerable, right? Very vulnerable to making decisions. I find it inconceivable that the Iranian response to we're about to collapse is, well, I guess let's all go sing sad songs up on a mountaintop. I mean, I think, there's a lot of IRGC guys out there who are going to want to take other people down with them and or be prepared to launch a massive onslaught in a last-minute, last-ditch hope that convinces Arab states or others to force the United States to back off, or try and get the U.S. to force the Israelis to back off. So I don't think you can consider it automatically that we would do that, but I don't think you should say, well, they never would do that because what's the point? I mean, again, they might believe that it's their only chance to save the regime if that's in fact the risk profile.
Because it provokes diplomacy. Maybe it provokes diplomacy.
That's right. And look, I mean, this shouldn't be seen as, I don't think that's very plausible. But then again, this is actually kind of the analog of what Trump is trying to say, right? Trump's argument is that the Iranians are going to be so beaten down, they'll have to accept my terms. Well, the Iranians might say, yeah, exactly. That's exactly our approach, that we will do the same sorts of things and put that pressure on you. Or we'll launch all of our missiles, shorter range as they are, on U.S. bases and similar too. So this goes to the question of who moves first. If the Iranians don't think they have another choice, I think it's absolutely, in play. Other cards they've got, right. I mean, clearly they've got terrorism. We haven't seen a whole lot of terrorist activity. I think, frankly, we always see terrorist activity. It's kind of, you can look at it either, kind of way. I think that the Iranians are probably going to look for targets of opportunity where they can, use terrorist tactics to go after Israeli targets. Those are operations that are harder to plan if they're not already in place, but that may be a thing that they do. Obviously, you've got the possibility of a future nuclear weapons test, which again shouldn't be, put off the table, notwithstanding what we and the Israelis might be doing. And then the last, as you pointed to, is the diplomatic side, which always gets short shrift. But, the longer this conflict goes on, we'll have to see what the Iranian play is. I mean, maybe they try and wrap themselves up in the Gaza issue and they try and say this is all part of a piece of what Israeli militancy looks like. It might be that they try and appeal to other states to back them in that sort of circumstance. That's something we haven't, fully developed yet because it's day 5.
All right, I'm coming right back to diplomacy in a second for the big question. But can we rule out, probably not, but what's your assessment of whether they would go after, and I think you've answered this, it depends, whether they would go after U.S. bases? I mean, it seems like right if they did that today, they would be inviting Trump to come in. But if the United States was already in there, they would probably do it.
Right. I mean, think about it. If we were sitting in Tehran right now, you might be saying, we don't want to bring in the U.S. We don't want to do this. So we're going to sit on this. We're just going to fire at the Israelis. Then you get reports that American warplanes are overflying Fordo and dropping bombs into your countrymen. Are you going to sit on your hands just because you're nervous about further inflaming the United States? At some point, you ask yourself, what's the point? Why would I not take that opportunity and maybe it's a long shot, maybe be able to compel the United States to back out of it? So I think, there is some chance that the Iranians take that sitting down. I don't think it's likely that they take the shots at the United States in the first instance to avoid bringing the U.S. in. But if the U.S. is in, frankly, I'm not sure if I'm an Iranian security person. I don't see the harm, frankly. You're already at war with the United States.
Might as well. Okay, well, let's go through one last energy question. I haven't seen much on just generally an impact on energy markets worldwide. Is there any? Do you have any shorthand for us on how energy markets will be impacted?
Well, right now, I think people basically are saying there isn't much of an impact because there hasn't been a lot of effect on trade going through and ships going through the Straits. And I think that there's a sense that the Iranians don't want to provoke the United States. They don't want to provoke China. They don't want to provoke the Arabs. And so they're gonna hold off. And that maybe the conflict will be contained. Maybe Israel will win quickly enough that you won't have that sort of problem. The actual, impingement on any Iranian supply is pretty low. They're only really exporting 1.5 million barrels per day. The Chinese are going to have to pay a little bit more for their oil. Not the end of the world. There is supply out there. So I think right now markets are basically banking on pretty quick Israeli success and low likelihood of the conflict spreading. My personal opinion is that is a mistake. I've got colleagues who say, well, the U.S. may be able to, stop the Iranians from attacking ships in the Straits, so maybe it's okay. But I think if I were right now in that sort of position, I'd be quite nervous about betting on either Iranian restraint or on the conflict being over real quick. It seems to me it's much more likely to be longstanding. It's got a bigger risk of spreading.
Okay, we're not out of the woods yet. What are the chances the U.S. taps the Strategic Petroleum Reserve again, assuming there's a major supply disruption?
So again, there are people out there who are a lot smarter on the SPR works, but having talked to some of the people I work with at Columbia, basically what they've said is the SPR is already down a bit anyway after sales that took place in the preceding years, and that there isn't as much there, and that you probably don't see it being tapped again until such time as there is a real disruption, not in anticipation of it. Right now, there isn't a real disruption, and prices are holding fairly stable. So is it in space if something were to really happen? Perhaps, but I don't think anyone's really contemplating that right now.
Okay. What is Russia's position on this conflict?
Russia, I think, has badly disappointed Iran because the Iranians thought that they were now, brothers after all this work they did together in killing Ukrainians, and that they were going to, have Russian support. And the Russians have essentially issued a press statement. So I think that the Russian position on this point has been, if you're Iranian, profoundly disappointing. Probably not shocking. I think the Iranians have a fairly low opinion of the Russians and their commitment there, but the Russians really haven't engaged in any kind of serious way. And I think the Iranians probably may have expected that, but they're still pretty disappointed in the lack of Russian engagement. they'll do diplomatic things. They'll complain about the U.S. and Israel at the IEA or UN Security Council, but that's basically the limit of what they've done. I think the real problem for Putin, though, is he doesn't like the idea of the Islamic Republic collapsing because, with Assad gone, he doesn't really have any friends in the region. So I would imagine his preference wouldn't be that's this be happening right now, but yeah, he's got other things to do.
Okay, Richard, here's the final question, the big question. I think you and I think that Trump is leaning towards a U.S. military strike.
Yeah.
However, let's not rule out the possibility that there could be a diplomatic initiative coming out of the White House soon. Let's say, and I'm looking at newspaper article headlines coming out right this second. Let's say it has something along the lines of Iran, the only way, essentially, that we are not going to bomb all of the nuclear facilities that we've discussed here in this podcast today is if you give up Fordow. You commit right now that there will be no more uranium enrichment on your territory. I want all 259 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. I want you to turn over all the centrifuges that are still intact, et cetera, et cetera. Does Iran take that deal? Is it even a good idea for us to, in the end, accept it? Can we trust the Iranians at the end of the day?
That to me is the threshold question, right? I mean, look, bottom line, I probably would have approached this entire situation differently than what people have. I think that there was space to try and get to a deal. But now that we are where we are, we're in a position where if there is a deal, you really have to question whether or not you can trust anything coming out of the Iranians, and they would have every incentive in the world to hold stuff back, potentially to say, no, we would give that extra 100 kilograms of 60%, but it was blown up. And you go check the rubble in Natanz. The post-conflict verification of this is going to be very, very difficult. I would lean on the word impossible, but maybe it's doable. But it will take time. And in the meantime, the Iranians have a bomb in the basement project. Tracking the number of centrifuges they have. Trump can say you have to bring all of your centrifuges to the docket, Bandar Abbas, and we're going to take them all away. Okay, here are all of our centrifuges. How do you prove that that's everything, especially after an attack that destroyed a number of them? So to me, that doesn't mean you can't have a deal, but it does mean that actually verifying the deal was already tricky when you had them consenting to it. And there was a lot of skepticism in the United States and other places about whether or not the Iranians could be trusted. I don't know how you can trust the Iranians now in these circumstances with this government, which is a bad thing because at some point you come back to the fundamental question, how does this end? If it doesn't end with regime change and it's the same guys in charge and you're not going to have a forever war, then tell me how this ends. And I don't have a great answer for that. And I think it's probably the topic we all need to be thinking about. What kind of verification system can you develop? How would you trust it? Who would execute it? How would you make sure that you're actually getting everything that's there? And then what do you do if the Iranians cheat, as they'd have every incentive to?
Richard, that was a tour de force. Thank you so much for joining us today. That was amazing. We're going to have you back. We covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me. Always good talking to you.
That was Richard Nephew. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please leave us a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.